Katanya, kita udah nggak bisa ngumpulin Cap Stample password dari negara Eropa lagi karena ada kebijakan EES. EES itu apa ya? Kenapa ya? Jadi, aku bakal ngejelasin kenapa Eropa memberlakukan kebijakan EES di negaranya yang akan dimulai pada tanggal 10 November 2024 nanti.
Now, rules for travellers going to the European Union from non-member countries will be changing over the next 18 months. A new €7 visa waiver.
Sistem pendaftaran elektronik untuk pendatang atau turis, EES, Entry or Exit System, adalah inisiatif baru yang diluncurkan oleh Uni Eropa untuk meningkatkan manajemen perbatasan dan keamanan. Entry or Exit System adalah sistem otomatis yang dirancang untuk mendaftarkan dan memantau pergerakan turis dari negara ketiga. Setiap kali mereka melintasi perbatasan eksternal Uni Eropa, sistem ini akan menggantikan metode manual yang selama ini digunakan seperti cap paspor dengan proses pendaftaran elektronik yang lebih efisien. Fitur utama Entry or Exit System yaitu menggunakan pengumpulan data biometrik. EES akan merekam nama, jenis dokumen perjalanan, dan data biometrik seperti sidik jari dan gambar wajah. Data ini akan digunakan untuk memverifikasi identitas pendatang saat memasuki atau meninggalkan wilayah Shengen. Pencatatan masuk dan keluar. Sistem ini akan mencatat tanggal dan lokasi masuk serta keluar sang turis, serta menandai penolakan masuk. Ini bertujuan untuk mendeteksi pelanggaran seperti tinggal melebihi waktu yang diizinkan. Penggunaan kios swadaya. Turis akan menggunakan kios swadaya di bandara dan titik perbatasan lainnya untuk memindai paspor dan memberikan data biometrik mereka. Sistem ini diharapkan dapat mempercepat proses pemeriksaan perbatasan. Penggunaan EES yaitu meningkatkan keamanan perbatasan, di mana dengan mengumpulkan data secara otomatis, EES bertujuan untuk memperkuat keamanan perbatasan dan mencegah imigran ilegal serta aktivitas kriminal lainnya. Selanjutnya, meningkatkan efisiensi proses imigrasi. Penggunaan teknologi pemindaian biometrik akan mempercepat proses pemeriksaan, mengurangi waktu tunggu bagi para pendatang di perbatasan. Selanjutnya, memfasilitasi pergerakan pendatang yang sah. EES diharapkan dapat membantu pendatang yang memenuhi syarat untuk melanjutkan perjalanan dengan lebih mudah sambil tetap menjaga keamanan. Untuk menggunakan EES, turis perlu memiliki paspor biometrik yang dilengkapi dengan chips elektronik. Turis tanpa paspor biometrik masih dapat memasuki Uni Eropa tetapi mungkin harus menjalani pemeriksaan tambahan. Selanjutnya, data berlaku selama 3 tahun. Data biometrik yang dikumpulkan akan berlaku selama 3 tahun, memungkinkan para pendatang atau turis untuk melintasi perbatasan dengan lebih cepat pada kunjungan berikutnya selama periode tersebut. Sistem pendaftaran elektronik bagi pendatang, EES merupakan langkah signifikan dalam modernisasi manajemen perbatasan di Uni Eropa. Dengan fokus pada keamanan dan efisiensi, sistem ini diharapkan dapat memberikan pengalaman perjalanan yang lebih baik bagi para turis.
There is a crisis happening here, along the border of Belarus and Poland. Thousands of migrants trying to make it deeper into Europe had been trapped in makeshift camps in freezing temperatures for weeks, often without water, food, or medical attention.
Thousands of people caught in the middle of an intensifying geopolitical dispute,
stranded in freezing conditions. Human rights groups say that the harsh conditions have already killed some of the migrants.
Migrants coming to Europe usually make their way through countries that border the Mediterranean Sea. But earlier this year, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia saw a spike in irregular crossings along their landlocked borders. When you take a closer look, you'll notice these crossings are taking place along Belarus's entire border with the EU. And the reason this border is the new epicenter of Europe's migration crisis is one man, Europe's last dictator. In 2020, Alexander Lukashenko claimed victory in Belarus's presidential election, an election widely believed to be rigged. Backed by his main ally Russia, Lukashenko ruled for 4 prior terms that were also considered fraudulent. But this time, the response was different. After the results were announced, thousands of Belarusians took to the streets, despite the pandemic, to demand Lukashenko step down. Instead, he responded with a brutal crackdown and arrested more than 7,000 protesters. Hundreds were beaten and tortured. 4 people died. And his political opposition was forced to flee the country. Lukashenko's nickname, Europe's last dictator, became more fitting than ever. The EU responded with sanctions, marking the beginning of a dangerous struggle between the EU and Belarus.
The EU will impose shortly sanctions on a substantial number of individuals responsible for violence, repression, and election fraud.
Despite this first round of sanctions, Lukashenko continued to crush dissent. He used prisons across the country to hold hundreds of political prisoners and arrested 27,000 civilians. So the EU doubled down and imposed 2 more rounds of sanctions. But Lukashenko only got more aggressive. In May of 2021, Belarus intercepted a passenger plane as it flew over Belarus's airspace. After forcing it to land, Belarus officials arrested a prominent Belarusian opposition journalist. He was allegedly forced to confess to plotting riots on camera. As of today, he's still under house arrest. The EU countered with yet another round of sanctions. This time, Lukashenko manufactured a crisis at the border to get back at them. Migrants hoping to get to Europe often make their way to these coastal areas and then take a dangerous boat ride to European shores. It's an arduous journey that can take days. Many don't make it. But in the summer of 2021, a seemingly easier path opened up. Shortly after the 4th round of EU sanctions, Lukashenko announced he wouldn't be stopping migrants from heading to the EU. It was more than just a warning. Belarus hadn't seen a lot of Middle Eastern migrants come through here in the past. So the Lukashenko regime created new ways to lure them into the country. Belarus began offering tourist visas to thousands in the Middle East, especially in Iraq. Flights from Istanbul, Damascus, and Dubai on Belavia, Belarus's state-owned airline, more than doubled compared to the same time last year. Encouraged by Belarus's open borders, thousands of migrants from war-torn zones arrived in Minsk. Once on the ground, reports show Belarusian guards bust them to the border along Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. But the EU border wasn't open to them. All 3 countries declared a state of emergency at the border and put up barbed wire fences. Looking for an opening, thousands of migrants eventually ended up here, at this checkpoint on the border, where things escalated. Poland rushed thousands of troops to the border to push the migrants back. They used tear gas and water cannons to stop migrants from crossing. On the Belarusian side, border guards wouldn't let the migrants retreat. They forcibly held them and pushed them to try again. As many as 4,000 migrants got trapped in this violent cycle. They couldn't go back to their home countries and couldn't go to Minsk either. Those tourist visas were no longer available to them. The EU labeled this hybrid warfare, and in many ways, it is an act of aggression. Belarus trapped the migrants, but the EU also failed the migrants by ignoring its own legal code, which prohibits collective expulsions or pushbacks and guarantees minimum rights for persons apprehended or intercepted in connection with irregular border crossings. Contrary to the law, the migrants here were denied their rights and pushed away. And it's not the first time it's happened. In 2015, Syria, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern countries were deep in conflict, forcing many to flee for safety. Back then, the safest route into Europe went through Turkey. From there, migrants could cross into Greece by land or take short boat rides across. Hundreds of thousands of migrants came in this way. It was the largest migration wave ever recorded in a single year, and the EU wasn't prepared. So, in March of 2016, the EU made a deal with Turkey. Put simply, Turkey would hold back migrants and take back any who made it to Greece. In exchange, the EU would pay Turkey 6 billion euros. With this deal, the EU moved its external borders from here to here, essentially outsourcing its border security and legal responsibilities. Human rights groups warned the deal was reckless and illegal, and made migrants subject to human rights violations. Still, the deal went on to take effect, and migrant arrivals in Greece plummeted. The deal was so effective in stopping the flow of migrants, it soon took on a new geopolitical importance. Over the years, Turkey learned it could threaten to let migrants in exchange for more funds from the EU. But it's not just Turkey. Europe has paid all these countries to keep migrants from its borders. You'll notice they form a buffer around Europe that stretches from Turkey to Morocco. In many of these places, migrants are subject to abuse and violence, including being pushed back to the conflict areas they are trying to escape. But Europe usually gets away with pushing back migrants because it happens here, far away and out of sight. And this gives all these countries leverage and incentive to use migrants as pawns. And that's exactly what Lukashenko is doing in Belarus, to try and get the EU to drop its sanctions. But it doesn't seem to be working.
And we agreed to expand the scope of the sanctions regime on Belarus. The road to the European Union does not lead via Belarus.
After weeks of escalation, the EU adopted yet another round of sanctions and pressured airlines to cut off major air routes from the Middle East to Minsk. Belarus has finally admitted to moving migrants to the border with Poland and has brought the migrants from the cold camps to nearby warehouses for now. But Lukashenko hasn't fully backed down yet. In fact, he's still encouraging migrants to cross into the EU. And that's because, as long as the EU continues to incentivize countries to keep migrants away from its borders, leaders like Lukashenko will find ways to exploit them.